Hi everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. Joining us today for the second last session of the PxP conference and day 3. It is my pleasure to be welcoming Sarah Lukeman as your moderator for the next session on what I know is a very topical topic. Every session I've listened to, this kind of topic has come up. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion on learning about different types of recognition for patient partners. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Janelle. And yes, thank you, everybody. Today's focus is best practice in patient partnerships. And a nice segue from the previous session, we will be concentrating on recognition and remuneration. I'm in Australia and have been a patient partner for over 10 years. And I'm joined by a panel of learned patient experts. You can find information on all of us by clicking on the resources tab underneath our pictures. When you do that, there's links that we have provided. We may reference stuff, so you'll find the links for that in links. And the speakers tab has all of our details. So we're not going to spend a lot of time giving you our bios. But I am joined by Kimberly, who's joining us from yesterday in Canada. I'm in Australia. And we've got Jack, who's joining us from Prague, where it's 5 a.m., but he normally lives in Australia. And Kwanele, who's also gotten up very early to join us from South Africa. So I want to thank them all and thank our audience also from wherever you're joining us. So by way of doing an introduction, could you each briefly outline the different roles you've filled as a patient partner in health research? And I'm curious to know if there's been any written agreements or role descriptions provided to you for any of those roles. And I'm going to start with Kimberly.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I'm happy to be here wherever you are in the world and whatever time it is. I've been involved in various patient engagement activities for just over a decade, and I originally became involved because I felt like I didn't have a voice in my own care. Now, when I look at the different research experiences I've had various levels of involvement. So some projects have offered many opportunities throughout the research process. I'm on a project right now where I'm looking at transcripts, I'm doing co-interviews, I've been involved in contributing to posters. So that's one area where I've been involved, but I've also been involved in more of the downstream involvement, so more at the end of the process. I'm on an advisory committee relating to clinical guidelines for primary care, and we aren't involved in doing the systematic reviews to produce the guidelines, but we do provide input and insight to framing the key messages. There's also what I call the bird's eye view of involvement. So being on a steering committee where you're not really in the day-to-day research, but providing input into the project. And finally, the reviewing side. So I've had a chance to be a peer reviewer. I've reviewed conference abstracts, and I've also had the chance to give feedback for the training modules that are available now for researchers and patient partners for the Institute for Musculoskeletal Health and Arthritis before they went live. And in terms of your question about written agreements, if I look at patient engagement in general, there's something usually in committees that I belong to that's called a terms of reference. So this talks about who's on the committee, what the expectations are, and a bit about the role. For me, the terms of reference are an essential document for any team. And when they're not there, there isn't a clear sense of scope for the project or the responsibilities. And this is especially true if the project veers off course. The terms of reference can help guide people back, and maybe the terms of reference spelled out the amount of hours you were going to do as a patient partner, and now the project has exceeded though, but the terms of reference can help guide you back and have a discussion about where to go next. So that's a bit about me.
That's great. Thank you, Kimberly. So Kwanele, what's been your experiences?
So I've been involved in scientific conference steering committees. I serve extensively on, or I used to serve actually extensively on something called the African Organization for Research and Training in Cancer, which is the premier cancer research institute on the continent. So I've been involved to try and ensure that the patient's voice is captured in the scientific conference proceedings. And I also have been involved in advisory roles, mostly for international organizations looking to do work on the continent. And I have also been involved with grant selection. But I, as a patient partner, have often been brought in sometimes as a tease to the scientists to say, you know, here is somebody who is a key stakeholder in health and who insists on being involved. You know, the notion from a human rights perspective, because I'm a trained lawyer, that you can't be making decisions about research directions and outcomes for me without me. So that's me in a nutshell.
No, that's great. Yes, nothing about us without us, I think, is the catchphrase.
And in terms of whether the roles have been written or not, no. Most of them have just had very global, this is what the project is about, this is what your contribution will be. But most of the time I've had to work it out for myself in terms of the scope of my involvement.
Yeah, okay. And just one question, when you've been brought in as a teaser to sort of challenge the researchers, who has been the decision maker who's had the ability to bring you in?
It'll be mostly the PI. Yeah, the PI on a project or some policy heavy hitter who will say, you know, come in and cause a little bit of upset and disruption.
And do they usually personally know you, Kwanele?
Yes.
Yes.
So it's people who usually personally know me or people who have been referred to me by other people who know me.
Great, thanks. So Jack, over to you. Your roles as a patient partner in health research, and if there's been written role descriptions for any of these.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning or evening, everybody. Yeah, I mean, about 15 years ago, I was working for Macmillan Cancer Support and working with the National Institute for Health Research, you know, training the public and researchers to work together and to figure all this stuff out. And I think a lot of the issues we're going to be discussing today were being discussed 15 years ago. And, you know, we're still trying to work it out. What do we call people and what do we pay them and why? Today I'm in Prague because I volunteer on what's called the Cochrane Consumer Executive, which looks to see about getting the public involved in the evidence synthesis that Cochrane does. But yeah, I mean, I've been on Australian government committees, including health technology assessment committees, is what they call the consumer representative. I've helping guide government policy in research on various committees and doing the grant assessment too. And I think all these different perspectives, including working on multiple research projects, either for free or you know, possibly paid as an investigator, you know, and I've also worked at a university helping create strategies for public involvement, looking at that institutional level. And I think, you know, all these perspectives have led me to feel that, you know, we need to move towards this kind of evidence-informed methods of how we decide what we do, and I can get into that later. But yeah, I ended up deciding to start a charity called Science for All to kind of have more control over how I worked with organisations as me, and doing that through a charity rather than as an individual, where it can get really tricky and complicated, and sometimes not particularly clear why you're being brought into a project, by whom and for what. and can say more about that. But yeah, that's why we set up the project, started or standardized data on initiative to try and get better data about who's doing what, so we can move towards it, evidence-informed ways of working. But yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
And do you have role descriptions for any of that work? I would imagine the government positions have terms of reference for the committees, as Kimberly mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's right. The government committee positions generally are pretty well defined in terms of the terms of reference. You're often paid sort of sitting fees, as they're called, or sometimes preparation fees. Certainly for the health technology assessment work, it was fascinating work. But you're maybe paid 1 day preparation, and it might have taken a lot longer than that. As a non-expert or non-clinician to come into these really diverse areas and speak on behalf of the public, all patients and all conditions, because you're the representative of the public. It's a big ask. So I think there may be payment, but is it always going to be sufficient, and is it giving enough time for the individual to prepare? Something's better than nothing, but is it enough?
No, exactly. Well, I've had very similar experience from the bird's eye view down to the down in the grass, and as all of you have spoken about. One that we haven't mentioned, a term that's sometimes used over here is a buddy, a consumer buddy, with a research team, so a discovery science team. They call it basic science, but there's nothing basic about it, so I prefer discovery science. And that's one of the jobs that I choose to do for love, rather than payment, because these lab-based researchers don't have a lot of funding, and there's certainly no written job description for it, but they get a lot of value out of having a bit of time. A couple of times a year I attend meetings, having some face-to-face with somebody with a lived experience on the condition that they're actually researching, which they otherwise wouldn't have. So that there's all different types of roles that we can all fulfill, and it sounds like there's different ways it's documented. So we'll start next with, in terms of recognition, in terms of how you've been recognised in a non-monetary way, first of all. So I'll start this time with Kwanele.
Yeah, so I have been recognized as a co-author, and I have also been extensively profiled as a patient voice, especially for the work around meaningful engagement that is being done by the WHO in Geneva, and also coming in to present at either scientific or policy conferences. But I wanted to say that it's very interesting that, sometimes because of the unequal power dynamics, the people who commission the work get to decide when to recognize you, especially as a co-author. For instance, I shall not name and shame these people, but I was involved on a very huge international project. And it wasn't just myself, it was about 8 of us over 2 years. And when the actual work was published, we were all just lumped together as we're grateful to our lived experience experts, whereas people who hadn't been as actively involved, but because they were in policy positions or research positions, were mentioned by name. And you had this list of about 50 people. And I was like, why couldn't you just put the 8 patient voices instead of just... So, what do I say to my grandchildren? Grandma was heavily involved in this work, but, she's in that throwaway line.
Yes, that's exactly the problem many times, is that power
Yeah.
balance.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure we've all had that experience in some form. Kimberly?
Yeah, just listening to Kwanele, I've had a bit of a different experience, I guess, when it comes to things like authorship. And I think when I've been pondering this question and in the environment in which I am, I view recognition and compensation as two completely different ideas. And for me, what I would consider the standard of good patient engagement, for some reason, it becomes mislabeled as recognition or a way to provide non-monetary payment to patients. And so when I think about presenting at a conference or being a co-author, to me, that is something that should be the standard of doing good patient engagement. These are not forms of payment in my books. They're not extras. They are what true patient partnership is all about. And if you're not offering all of these things, then you have to ask yourself, do you really value the patient partner on your team? Or is it more a tokenistic thing where you're going to just, like Kwanele said, you know, put them in the group and not really acknowledge them? That said, I view recognition as things that team members do that show a genuine appreciation for my work. So it's like, it's sharing gratitude, whether it's public recognition in a group setting or an email thanking me for my involvement, or a card that sincerely thanks me. Or, you know, it could be even giving a shout out to the patient partner when you're doing a presentation and say, hey, Kimberly contributed to this. You know, that is really impactful. And it may seem like little things, but those little things mean, it just means so much to me as a patient partner. And it really shows that you value me as a member of your team.
I really like that. Recognition should just be standard, a part of everything we do. And it certainly is not equivalent to compensation. Yes, that's great. Jack, what are your experiences with recognition? Let's just call it that.
Yeah, I think just to build on Kimberly's point as well, you know, whoever's working with who or involving who, you know, I think considering the support that different people need and have as a matter of respect and inclusion, you know, whether that's emotional support or training or even practical tech support. And I think that, you know, that just to get to the point where they can then get involved and be recognized. Yeah, and I think, you know, I've been co-investigated, co-author, or what have you, but it's often not well articulated exactly who did what or who did which tasks. And I think, you know, that, and certainly on the wiki journals, which are Wikimedia's open access, free to publish, peer-reviewed journals, you know, they try and make that clear. But even sort of author, co-author, or acknowledgements and stuff, it doesn't really capture it sometimes. So that's where some of the thinking behind standardized data on initiatives or started came from, which is where you can say, well, who did which tasks? You know, this person was the lead investigator. They maybe got the funding, but actually it was a group of people with some lived experience, and they provided their perspectives, or they helped write the research application. These people helped write the paper or gather the data or analyze. You know, having a really kind of granular sort of amount of information about exactly who did what. And I think, you know, also on that, you know, getting the terms right as well, co-creating the terms we're using to describe people and checking that they self-identify with them. You know, do we mean patient all the time? Or do we mean a member of the public or a carer? Or do we mean a lay person? Or is it a citizen scientist when it's this project? And that very much relates to the different tasks people are doing and why they're being asked to do those. Is it because they have a specific lived experience, they have specific skills or experiences? Or is it because we want their perspective or their lay perspective, if I can use that term? So I think all of those things have got to be considered and kind of negotiated and agreed so that people understand coming in why they're being asked to come in, not just because someone said, oh, we've got to do this thing called patient and public involvement, but why? And then I think just finally, for everyone, and in particular researchers, to think about motivation as a consideration, their motivation for trying to involve people, and to consider the motivation for people getting involved. And I think certainly early to mid-career researchers as well, who might also be patients or what have you, there might be the motivation to get your name on a co-authored paper, or have different incentives, to have worked on certain teams. So I think just being really transparent and open about that from the start makes everyone feel a lot more comfortable and able to kind of ask for that support and say, well, actually, am I going to be acknowledged, and how? And so, yeah, that's what we try and do is start it, is say from the standardized stage on initiatives, is say, this is how we plan to work, this is how we plan to report it, and then actually do that and report it in that way.
In the earlier session today, Harry talked about psychological safety and the need for that support for people. I'm actually keen to know, Kimberly, have you ever had that provided to you or felt the need for it, had the lack of that in any of the work you've done?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the things that is really important to me as a patient partner, to feel safe in the environment that I'm in. And I have had I remember an instance where it really didn't feel safe, and it really triggered something traumatic for me. And it was a horrible situation. And I don't think anybody, we've all gone through our own experiences dealing with our health, and we don't need to have that replicated when we're doing patient engagement. And I think sometimes the people doing the engagement, I'm sure they mean well, but they don't see it from our lens, or how something so simple could be so triggering for somebody that is being a patient partner. So it's definitely something that's important, and I don't think it's really, I think it needs to be talked more about. And I would really love to see, the people that are engaging with patients to have more training on, what does trauma-informed patient engagement look like, so we're not re-traumatizing people.
Yeah, great. Jack.
Yeah, I think just briefly on that, this gets into ethics, and I know this is a separate discussion, but there's sort of formal ethics one might need before doing a project, the human research ethics committees, but there's also the concept of ethical involvement, and where you're considering all those things Kimberly just said, where you're really thinking carefully about how to involve people in a sensitive way, and often it's by co-designing or co-creating the way you're going to involve people with perhaps a small select group. Is this an appropriate way of working? And so not just relying on the human research ethics committees or what have you to go, oh, have you thought, but actually ethical practice in this area, which might include all those, trauma-informed or what have you ways of working. So absolutely, but that's definitely a separate discussion. But yeah, just wanted to mention that.
Yeah. Kwanele, did you have anything to add to this one?
Yeah, I saw the issue about psychological safety, and I prefer to phrase it the way Jack kind of mentioned earlier, the issue of respect. I know that there can be a lot of undermining in these spaces where you as a patient partner says something, makes a contribution, and people's eyes just glaze. And then a colleague who's a scientist or a policy maker, in my instance, says something which is very similar to what you just said, and all of a sudden it's an issue. I have had experiences where I was a chairperson of the country's cancer advisory committee, the Ministerial Cancer Advisory Committee, and the politician responsible would seek to undermine me in these high-level meetings with scientists, where I've had to constantly bring a copy of my Constitution of the Republic to say, you know, the right to participate is a fundamental human right. So we tend to talk about social participation. We tend to talk about meaningful engagement. For me, those terms are problematic because they leave the power to the scientist or to the policymaker to decide what it ought to look like. Whereas when we do rights speak, then there's an entitlement in law to participate, and to participate in a meaningful, respectful, ethical manner, and an obligation to include you. It's not a favor that's being done to you. You are, you know, you're a health consumer, and you should be able to participate substantively. So I use the term substantive inclusion, substantively in health decisions that affect you.
So that's a perfect segue, thank you, Kwanele, into the next question, which is the bit everybody's been waiting for, which is payment, the remuneration, and how that has worked for you over the years in different forms. I've actually, just before we move on, for those who haven't, the first session on Wednesday, Libby Humphrey spoke about, she was awarded an honorary research associate title. And that, I was really impressed to hear about that. It gave her access to the university library and university email, which are two pretty big things for a patient to have access to. So I think, yes, recognition is just a given. Our involvement is a given, but there are extra things that can be done to recognise this beyond payment. And sometimes it's just thinking a bit differently and having the discussion. But Kwanele, no, let's start with Jack this time. Jack, what form of payment have you received as a patient partner over the years in your different roles?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's at the beginning, sort of, you know, nothing. Sometimes, you know, and that's not why you're doing it. Then maybe, you know, gift cards, honorariums, or what have you. And I think, you know, a lot of people, and myself included, moved into sort of, you know, being a consultant. You know, when you're running a family or have you, and you can run a business, and in my case, starting a charity. So there's all that entire spectrum. There's a lot of people in each country, it's different. But, you know, I think certainly when I was advising the university and, you know, working with the government as well, I was always just trying to say that you need to kind of co-create how people want to be paid as well. Everyone's going to have, different people are going to have different preferences. And some people might not want to be paid, well, okay, it's always good to offer. But yeah, honorarium isn't a payment, it's an honorarium. And I also think it's about thinking also, you know, if you pay someone, is that going to affect benefits or what have you? So having those sort of alternative systems ready to go. But I mean, I think certainly what I've realized, and I think this is true certainly in the UK and Australia, is there are kind of structural issues. You know, universities aren't set up. They don't have a sort of a category for this kind of thing called involvement. And when you look really into it, which I have, because I maybe need to get out a bit more, but, you know, there's the tax offices don't actually have tax categories to describe this either. So the universities can't then pay people. So then they have to have these really onerous ways of getting money into it. And that's before you become a chief investigator or an associate investigator. So I think there are really important structural issues that haven't been solved. But I guess in conclusion, you know, not sorting out the kind of admin or the bureaucracy or the structural issues of paying people, it kind of can become a form of structural violence that perpetuates, you know, oh, well, we can't pay you because we have to just give you a gift card. And we haven't sorted out the admin because it's just too hard. And I get it, it is hard. It's hard for researchers and for institutions to do it. And it's hard for the government to figure it out. But the government needs to figure it out. All governments need to figure it out and support institutions to pay people properly. And it's a massive job, but it needs to be done. Otherwise, we're actively excluding people who are marginalized, and we're not hearing from the people we need to hear because they can't afford to get involved. And we're almost, inducing that ignorance and perpetuating inequity by constantly not supporting sometimes the most vulnerable people, the people most at risk of exploitation, just because the admin's a bit difficult. And it's just not good enough anymore. So I would advocate, if you're, do what you can to look into that bureaucracy behind the scenes, because there's always a way to work something out, but it can be very convoluted and confusing. I hope that's a helpful answer. I'm happy to say more.
No, that's good, and you've foreshadowed a few of the areas we're going to be moving into. Kwanele, we'll go to you. Payment in South Africa is not as standard.
It's not a standard thing, and then you get involved. I mean, we, as patient advocates, especially some of us who've been at it for 17 years plus, we have made some headway globally. There were times where I would get invited to an international conference, to give a keynote, but my travel and my accommodation would not be sponsored. And that's still very true on the continent, or people will give very glib support, like $500 to attend a conference. I mean, how are you buying a ticket and accommodation? So I have received honorariums. I have had my travel expenses covered, but like we keep saying, Kimberly, Jack, and myself keep saying, that is not payment. Those should be participation and enablers, and they should be standardized for everybody. And when we're looking from a justice, I like how Jack frames things. When we look from a justice perspective, when we don't give these enabler and participation enablers, we are perpetuating global health disparities, because then certain voices that are more established get recycled over and over again. And then we have this tendency of people getting on stages or writing research on behalf of, instead of empowering affected communities to participate in their own thing. So I have been personally doing a lot of work around remuneration, especially for African patient partners, because most of us who read researchers will come across that sub-Saharan Africa suffers a disproportionate burden of mortalities and morbidities and ever-increasing burdens of disease. And then you don't have people from the continent to help you ask the why questions, and people who will very expressly speak to structural barriers to participation. It is important that we are remunerated. And one thing that people have to keep in mind is that most of us patient partners at the global level have other qualifications. So when you are sitting in your comfortable office and writing to me as a patient partner to please do something pro bono, I take it as a form of disrespect, because you are saying to me that my contribution, both lived experience and academic, are not important enough for you to pay and compensate for my expertise and my time. And finally, when we are doing patient engagement, please don't ask people to pay for themselves and then you will reimburse them, because that is another way of keeping other people out. How many patients who are not in full-time employment can afford, for instance, to pay $350 as a discounted price for participation for low and middle income countries for a conference fee. Pay upfront, pay for your travel, we will reimburse you, and then you get lost in the bureaucracy of institutions. When it comes for time to reimburse you, it takes like another 3 to 6 months, which we can't afford.
Yes, yes. In preparation for this session, Kimberly raised that it's a privilege to volunteer that not everybody has. Kimberly, perhaps we'll bring you in at this point to share your experiences.
I feel like Kwanele saw my notes ahead of time. I have a lot of the same points, but yes, similar to both Kwanele and Jack, like I've been paid by honoraria. The hourly rate where I'm having to track hours, which for me, I find really stressful. I'm just not good at this. I've also had someone else tracking the hours, which I find very helpful. I've had the situation of gift cards, and I remember one organization, I wanted the financial compensation and they weren't able to provide that. So I actually accepted the gift card and used a website in Canada. Don't worry, it was totally legitimate, but I could get the cash for the gift card. But the problem with this was then the cash wasn't the equivalent amount of the gift card. But, you know, if you're a researcher and you think that gift cards are going to solve all of your compensation problems, I urge you to do an experiment and go to your dentist and give them a coffee gift card for paying for your dental fees and see how well that goes. And Kwanele has beautifully said this, but expenses and compensation, I just want to reinforce that those things are not the same thing. It's another standard that your expenses should be covered as a patient partner, and patients should not be paying for the privilege to participate. If a research team is going to a conference, then you need to budget for the involvement of patient partners. So things like the hotel, the transportation, the conference fees, and like Kwanele said, pay that up front, because if you don't, you're going to be limiting who can afford to participate. And it's going to be the ones with the financial means, and that really doesn't create a diverse group of patient partners.
Mm. We seem to have lost Jack, but I just wanted to raise, you know, for those who are in Australia, honorariums, assuming that that's not your main source of income and you're not reliant upon them, are not taxable. Generally, honorariums are not taxable, so they're not seen as something that you live on. Kwanele.
I think Kimberly raised a very important point about when we lose value. Like if you paid $1,000 and people do not factor in that to transfer money internationally, their bank fees. So then my honorarium is not even what was given. In the South African situation, I have worked for one of the lead universities. They pay me and then I'm taxed. And then it doesn't, so the payment is low and then I have to be taxed on top of that when it comes to you, really, it doesn't make sense.
And we've sort of talked about the whole diversity and inclusiveness of the consumer workforce and how not paying cuts out people. Kimberly, you've done some work on this, I believe.
Yeah, I have. I'm not sure if I call it, I'm not sure how to frame it, but with a bunch of my peers, we did co-write a paper that was about compensation. And, you know, in that paper, we did argue that compensation is a form of equity, and it's a form of, you know, tearing down those barriers. Because when we're not paying people to participate, as Kwanele has mentioned, we're getting the same people who can actually afford the privilege to do this without the compensation. So it's a paper that we ironically worked on for free about compensation. And we did have a follow-up paper that is a really great resource for researchers about how to even bring up that discussion to go through that with a patient partner, because it's something that needs to be done and it needs to be brought up by the researcher. It shouldn't be on the patient to have to go, oh, by the way, am I paid? Again, getting back to standards of what good engagement looks like, having that discussion from the beginning and kind of going from there. But yes, I think compensation can be one form of equity, but it's not definitely, it's not going to fix everything, but it is one tool that we have.
And those papers are in the resources that I referred to earlier. I see in the chat, Janelle Bowden has said, check the Australian Tax Office site for honorariums. And yes, I do have the quote here, but I won't bore you with that. Jack, just before we lost you, and welcome back, I was going to ask you about the evidence base, of the evidence for informed ways to involve patients. If you had anything specific to share there.
Yeah, certainly. Just checking everyone can hear me and see me okay.
Yep, all good.
Crash. Yeah, I mean, I think, as mentioned, I'm joining from the Global Evidence Summit at the moment, which is Cochrane, JBI, Guidelines International, Campbell, and I was at a health technology assessment conference recently too. In both cases, we get bursaries or scholarships to attend. I can't afford to attend these conferences myself, but it's amazing seeing the ratio of kind of people affected by or patients living with, to professionals, clinicians, what have you. And I think, if the biggest organizations in the world in these spaces are running conferences and aren't always sure about the best ways to involve and include people, I think it shows to me we need to do more work. And conferences aren't everything, but they're sort of a demonstration sort of the field and the area, and who's there and who feels they want to be there and that they can attend. And I think certainly, we've talked about the structural issues, including things like visas, just not to gloss over it, but people from certain countries, it's really hard to go to certain other countries, and it's a lot of applicants. It's really expensive, and people need support just to get through the visa process, to get something. So it's great to have this on. But back to the question, I think what I see, this is my personal perspective, is a complete lack of standardized reporting about who's being involved and how and what methods work. And I think this is particularly sort of alarming and concerning for working with Indigenous peoples around the world as well, where we know, according to the United Nations Convention on Indigenous Peoples, they're not the dominant people in society. That's the word that's used. And we need to work extra hard to involve them. And I think there's a lack of data about what works well. And I think what we need to do, as a patient public movement is get better at reporting how we've involved people, what works well, so we have evidence, so that we can start to move towards evidence-informed ways of working, so that when governments, institutions, universities, they're tightening their belts and counting their beans and going, well, how can we do this involvement thing really cheaply, which is fair enough. No one has infinite resources, and I think organizations that are transparent about that, it's really, we have this much money, how should we spend it? If we actually have an evidence base to go back to and go, well, the evidence-informed methods suggest if we work in these countries, that's worked well in the past. And of course, it's never a one-size-fits-all, but if we have more data out there about what's worked well in the past, which methods have which impacts, we can start to move towards evidence-informed ways of working. And as mentioned, that's one of the hopes we're trying to achieve with STARDIT, or standardized data on initiatives. But it's a big piece of work, and we've all got to be involved in helping report the successes and the things that haven't worked, so that we can help future people come into this who are going, where do I start? We go, well, here's the literature and here's some data and you know, here's a systematic review, but we just don't have the quality of the data at the moment really to do as good a job as we should be. Happy to say more.
Yeah, and that's something that a group that I have done a lot of work with in Australia, CTIQ, some may know, and we're actually encouraging them to publish the process that we've used to involve consumers. And I've been involved with them for a couple of years, developing a new template for participant information consent forms, which every person on a clinical trial in Australia has to receive. And one of the key things is to actually involve consumers throughout the process to help develop those. But, you know, there's not a lot of evidence of the benefit of this. You know, ethically, I think we all agree that that's something that just should be done. And we're now doing work, and again, there's not much evidence out there about sharing information, and particularly sharing the results with the participants in a trial. And I was on a clinical trial, and the paper that my data is in, I have a copy of that, but I didn't get it from the clinical trial team. I was given it by somebody else. And I think it's just a sign of respect, again, for people who have given their time, and sometimes a lot more than time, bodily fluids and other things, to a clinical trial to get those results. So that's, yeah, so anybody who's out there, you know, when you're working with researchers, you know, raise with them about actually publishing the process used to involve them, because there is just a scant amount of literature out there. So that would be a really good thing. We've got one question that's been placed in the Q&A, and I see there's been a huge chat, which I haven't been able to keep up with. Kimberly, the question is specifically to you, so relating to not feeling safe. So please, if you don't want to answer this, just let us know, and maybe somebody else does. But the question was, does it pertain to not being comfortable asking questions that are actually important to you? And did you want to elaborate upon that?
I think we could have a whole panel on trauma and the impact of that and how that relates to patient engagement. If I'm thinking about a recent experience, it was with a committee I was involved in for many, many years. And we were at a meeting, and all of a sudden someone decided to invite a person to this meeting that had actually been involved in my care. And I instantly was just so triggered, and I was panicking, and I didn't know what to do. And this was online. And I was messaging one of the people in charge and saying, can you ask them to leave? Like either they leave or I leave because I can't stay here if they're here. And fortunately, they managed to get that person to leave. But I mean, then you're in this kind of revved up state, and nobody else would have known what was going on behind the scenes, because obviously I wasn't, broadcasting it to the entire group. But, that's just like a little thing like that, where you've invited someone randomly to a meeting, and I'm sure they had no idea that that could have the impact that it did on me. And that, that made that setting not a safe setting for me in that moment.
Yeah, no surprises is always a good thing to try and work towards. We've getting close to the end. In terms of standards, in New South Wales, the Department of Health has put a rate out, and Health Consumers New South Wales has that rate as well. But interestingly, when the Department of Health released that, they didn't give any extra funding to the people in the department to actually pay for the consumers. So I don't know how they were meant to do that. What I'm keen to know, particularly Kwanele, in Africa where there isn't a lot of this happening, how important are these standards to help recognise patient partners and, you know, ideally remunerate them?
Yeah, so the WHO Geneva issued a normative standard framework last year on meaningful engagement that I was very heavily involved in. And I am hoping that since it is a pseudo-legal tool, it is going to help mainstream patient engagement on the continent and in other places. You know, I'm listening and I'm very fascinated working with you and my colleagues from the international world. What most of the world doesn't realize is that patient engagement frameworks do not exist in places like South Africa. I mean, we have frameworks for the HIV/AIDS sector. They have representation up to the presidency. And they are involved in high-level researches and policy making. But it's because their movement was very disruptive, right? You know, that notion of nothing about us without us. And people living with AIDS, really, we owe a debt of gratitude to them. Because in my work, I keep saying it can be done for non-communicable diseases. It can be done for mental health. Look at the AIDS people. But there's this lack of understanding. I don't think it's malicious. It's just a lack of understanding of what patient engagement is and what it ought to be. And as long as we do not have these standards, we're going to keep struggling. And that's why I agreed to participate today, because, you know, I could then say to my networks, please tune into this global conversation. Look at our colleagues who've been at it for 15 years and are not totally getting it right, but it is being done and it can be done here. And for me, it will always be an issue of justice.
Mm. Yeah, no, very good.
Health justice, right? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I guess it's worth, you know, sharing a few practical examples. So, you know, I've received gift cards. I live regionally in New South Wales in Australia, so sometimes those gift cards I haven't been able to spend where I live. So that's been interesting. And Kimberly mentioned the administrative burden, and a project that I really love and I'm really passionate about. I'm 9 months behind putting through an invoice because I'm really not passionate about my administrative workload. So yes, if somebody else will keep track of my time, I'm totally with you, Kimberly, on that one. And I've actually, that has happened for a couple of the groups that I work with, which has been really good. They know I'm attending these meetings and they just, you know, send through the paperwork and just say, sign this, and off it goes. Makes it much easier. I think if you're having problems, raise it with the people that you're working with. And the other thing that I think we need to, you know, all be aware of, you know, it's sad to hear that in South Africa, it's the HIV/AIDS patients have got the voice all the way up to the president, but they haven't helped bring the rest of the patient experience with them. And so it's something I try to be mindful of when I'm in the room is keeping the door open for others so that they can come through after me. And if I don't need the money, perhaps others do, you know, just raising it is important. We've got a couple of minutes left. And we've talked about structural problems. A few of us have mentioned that. Let's just open it up. If there's anything else that you really like to share about getting adequate recognition and remuneration for meaningful patient partnerships and making it meaningful for every patient. Let's start with Jack.
Thank you. I think really just I'd like everyone to try and think about what we're doing with involvement, engagement, and you know, thinking about that as just part of the research methodology. It's just a standard part of the research methodology, and therefore research funders need to fund it as a standard part of research grants, and governments need to have a standard. As you say, they actually need to put the money there. It's a bit like open access. Everyone wants it. No one's quite sure who's supposed to be paying for it. And I think with involvement, if we treat it more just as part of the research, this is the methodology, this is the involvement research, it's going to be more rigorous, and it can be better funded. That would support research institutions well, and it will make everything we do more inclusive. But you know, everyone needs support from research institutes right down to the public. So if we see it as part of research methodology, I think that'll be good for everybody. I'll leave it there in the interest of time.
Okay, I'll pass over to Kimberly, and I will just say a couple of questions have come up. I don't think we're going to be able to answer them, but there will be an anonymized summary of the chat with all the links made available afterwards, and we will try and answer these questions offline. But Kimberly, final comments from you?
I would say that meaningful patient partnerships come from a variety of tools. And if you think that compensation is going to somehow magically create a wonderful research environment, or it's going to, you know, make people view our knowledge as valid, that's not how it works. So it's using compensation and a host of tools. And I think if you are somebody that is partnering with patients with regards to compensation, there are things that you can do. I'll call it pre-work is the dream work. So anything you can do ahead of time. So figuring out your policies, having that one-to-one discussion with patients. Some patients may not want compensation, and that's totally fine, but you need to have that conversation to figure it out. Post your payment practices online. Patients shouldn't have to be, you know, it's nice to know that there is payment, but then when you don't post it, the onus is back on the patient to have to bring it up again. And then be proactive. If you know the payment's delayed, tell us. If there are problems, help us. You can be an ally for patient partners when things go wrong, and they will with the payment process. But when we know we have someone on our team that's willing to fight for us, it just makes the experience so much better.
Yeah, transparency is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Kwanele, final words from you? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
And I was doing so well all night long. Final words from me on behalf of people in the developing world where patient engagement is not standardized is to my colleagues in the global north to please help support and the movement here. We need global solidarity, and we also need knowledge partnerships. You know, whatever has worked for you, please share and let us empower patients in other areas of the world to be meaningfully engaged as research partners and policy partners. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And Janelle has appeared, so our time is up. So I want to thank all of our speakers and everybody who's been chatting away in the chat. And I hope this has provided some useful information to people. As was said by Rancy in the session before ours, compensation is not what drives us. That's not why we're doing it. But gee, wouldn't it be nice if we could actually, you know, this could be a paid job. I think there is enough work for that. And maybe that's what we're heading towards. So I'll leave that there and hand over to Janelle. Thank you all very much.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you to all the speakers. I think this session certainly lived up to expectations from my point of view as to being a very active session in the chat, as well as so many great insights from all of the speakers around the different types of recognition, that it's not all about the money, that importance that money isn't what drives us, but it improves health, equitable access to these opportunities and the diversity of voices that we're getting involved. The concept of, you know, involvement being a natural part of the research process and the research method, and therefore should be funded as such. Some really great takeaways. So congratulations to you and all the speakers. And I will wrap up the session now. We are back live in 15 minutes for our You Can't Ask That session. I'm a little trembling about that, but be kind and I'll see you soon. Thank you.